What if I told you the biggest risk to your HRIS implementation isn't the software, it isn't your project team, and it isn't your executive sponsor? It might be the way your implementation partner gets paid. After spending years on both sides of HRIS implementations, on the client side and as a consultant, I've seen one variable almost no client asks about, and it can completely change the behavior of the consulting firm that you've hired. So before you sign your next implementation contract, make sure you listen to this episode. Welcome to the HRIS Careers Podcast with your host, Troy Wallace, a podcast for human resources information systems professionals to help you elevate your HRIS career. We always say no one gets into HRIS on purpose, but it sure is interesting to find out how they did. We interview your HRIS peers to find out how they got tricked into the industry and what lessons and tools they use to progress their careers along the way. We discuss industry trends, AI, and even talk candidly about all the most popular HRIS platforms. Just think of it as the closest bar just outside the entrance of your favorite HR technology conference. Now you get it. Welcome in. Welcome back to the HRIS Careers Podcast, broadcasting live from the beautiful studios in downtown Omaha, Nebraska. Indeed, I am in downtown. Once again today, we're going to continue on the theme of solo episodes, and I wanted to share an observation from my own career. I've seen this so many times working on both sides of HRIS implementations, inside organizations buying technology, and then on the consulting side, helping clients implement it. And one thing I've witnessed repeatedly is something that almost no one talks about during vendor selection, and yet it can have a major impact on the success of your implementation. It's all about the incentives. So when your company decides to implement a new HRIS, whether it's Oracle or Workday, SAP, some more niche system, it's very common to go out and hire an implementation partner. On the high end, maybe it's the KPMGs or PricewaterhouseCoopers, maybe IBM, or there are so many specialty boutique consulting companies out there, and that totally makes sense. All these firms have experienced consultants, proven methodologies, and they normally have people who've completed dozens of implementations, or they're aligned with a particular software vendor. For instance, Oracle tends to have their recommended partner list. I'm sure it's similar for Workday and SAP. And I've worked with some incredible consultants through my career. Some bad as well. That's a different episode. This episode is not saying consulting companies are bad. Far from it. It's about understanding how their business model may unintentionally create incentives that don't always align with your organization's success. Because when incentives are misaligned, behavior almost always follows. So you may find if you're in this day-to-day, the holy grail for a consulting company is the fixed bid project. So I will admit, I do tend to work more on hourly basis projects, but if I get the opportunity to do a fixed bid project, I am licking my chops because I know I can set that price. Typically, I know I can beat it, and those tend to be a little bit more appealing and profitable on the consulting side. Now, on the client side, fixed bid project can be appealing as well. You know what the project will cost. You can budget appropriately. Of course, we know there's always change orders, but, hopefully it is somewhat predictable. And, of course, the consulting firm would assume all of the delivery risk. On paper, everybody wins. But what happens after the contract is signed is where things get a little bit interesting. And here's something that many clients never ask. How are the leaders responsible for delivering the implementation actually compensated? In many consulting organizations, whether they're big four firms or boutique implementation partners, that director, partner, senior manager, vice president responsible for the engagement is measured on what's called gross margin. I don't want to bore you with all the details and calculations of gross margin, but sometimes their incentives and bonuses depend on achieving a minimum gross margin percentage. So real quickly, let's talk about what gross margin means. So the distinction kind of matters. So you've got your revenue, right? This is what you're paying as a client. That is going to be their top line revenue for the project. Then you have a gross profit, right? That is the revenue minus what the project directly costs your consulting company. And then from those two numbers, you can get gross margin percentage, which is gross profit divided by revenue. So in that scenario, the revenue is already fixed. The consulting company can't necessarily increase what you're paying. So if they want to improve their gross margin, they have to reduce costs. And in a services business, unfortunately or fortunately, people are the cost. So this doesn't mean that necessarily a consulting company is acting maliciously. In fact, most consultants are genuinely good. They want to help their clients succeed. But, some of these organizational incentives are very powerful. And I've seen it manifest in a bad way with some large consulting companies and boutiques as well. And I am telling you, let's say the gross profit margin is 30%. That leader for that services or consulting company is looking at that number. And as it gets dangerously close to going below that 30% number, they are going to change their behavior. And that can manifest in a lot of different ways, but normally that is not in the client's favor, especially if their bonus relies on that project staying above that 30% gross profit margin. And I've seen situations where projects suddenly become much more focused on controlling the consulting costs. Maybe there's fewer senior consultants assigned. Maybe experienced resources are replaced with junior team members. Maybe hours become more tightly managed. Maybe you have some gray area client deliverables that are pushed toward change orders. Maybe issues that deserve deeper discussion receive just enough attention to move the project forward. Individually, none of these decisions may seem significant, but together, they can dramatically change the client experience. So one reason I wanted to share this topic is because I've seen it across the industry. I've seen it within some of the largest consulting organizations in the world, smaller boutique firms. This isn't unique to one company. It is a business model. And once you understand the incentive, certain behaviors suddenly make a lot more sense. So here's the takeaway and some practical things you can do or explore with your consulting company to make sure that incentives are aligned the right way. So when you're evaluating your implementation partner, of course, you're going to ask about the methodology. You're going to ask about how many certified consultants they have. You're probably going to ask about references. But you really need to ask this question. How are the leaders responsible for my implementation compensated? Or perhaps are project leaders measured or incentivized based on gross margin? Ask real specifically. Of course, they may not disclose every detail, but the conversation itself could be very valuable. Because if the incentives are heavily tied to profitability, you should understand how that could influence project decisions. So the best consulting firms, recognize this tension. But I will say I've encountered a couple of, I'll call renegade partners within good consulting firms. But most of them want to balance the profitability with the long-term customer success, right? They want that next project. They understand that a successful implementation should lead to future work, stronger references, and lasting relationships. The best project leaders don't optimize for just one engagement or the current engagement. They optimize hopefully for trust. And certainly those are the partners that you want. So one of my favorite business sayings is, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. In HRIS implementation, the technology matters, project management matters, executive sponsorship matters, but the incentives matter too. As a client, you shouldn't need to become an expert in consulting economics, but there are some basics that you should know, and this is one of probably the thoughtful questions that you should ask is, how is your leadership incented? And again, maybe even asking specifically, is gross margin part of their bonusing or incentive system? Because the more you understand how your implementation partner measures success, the better position you're going to be to make sure that their success is aligned with yours. So I don't often plug my own company, which is HCM Cloud Consultants. You can reach it at HCMCloudConsultants.com, but I will in this case. I don't feel organizations reach out for help in this capacity, whether they are selecting a particular piece of software and selecting the consulting organization. If you do need help with that or just a little guidance, sometimes just even a quick conversation before you get into one of these situations helps. Certainly happy to help. You can reach me at troy.wallace@hcmcloudconsultants.com. That is my consulting firm that I don't typically shout out on these episodes. But I do think it's an important subject matter, and just a little extra pre-work in the selection process can go a long, long ways. So as always, I want to thank you for listening to another episode of the HRIS Careers podcast. If you've been through an HRIS implementation, I'd love to hear your experience. I'm going to link to some other relevant episodes. We had Bonnie Tinder, who runs a company, Raven Intelligence, that helps you select consulting companies. It's almost like a Yelp for implementation partners. We had Greg Laney on the podcast, and he wrote a book literally about HRIS implementations that touches on this a little bit as well. But again, I'd love to hear your experience. Have you ever noticed behavior that seemed driven more by the consulting firm's internal goals or financial success more than yours? Certainly, I'll post this on LinkedIn. Leave comments on LinkedIn, or just hit me back at troy.wallace@HRISCareers.com. And especially if you're willing to share your experience, I'd love to have some people on the podcast that have gone through this. Don't have to name names, but it may be interesting to hear about some real-world examples. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here, and we'll see you next time on the HRIS Careers podcast.